14 million voices buried beneath decades of gunfire curfews and whispered prayers were fading into dust until one parchment inked by the hand of Pope Leo X crossed a desert of doubt and landed in the trembling grasp of President TRAORÉ. Tonight you will watch that moment unfold, the square packed shoulder to shoulder, the sun flaring off a crimson wax seal, and a soldier's rifle slowly lowering as the first line is read aloud. Because in that instant when faith collided with fear, an entire continent stopped breathing, if only to hear a single heartbeat of hope. But step closer. Imagine you're a child whose lullaby is mortar fire. Would you dare to believe a stranger thousands of miles away could hear you cry? This film is a creative reimagining, woven from real histories of conflict and courage. Facts are dramatized, emotions are genuine, and every heartbeat you feel belongs to people still waiting to be heard. So take a breath, because the letter has just been opened, and its next word might change you too. Ouagadougou's Freedom Square, midday. The sun over Ouagadougou didn't shine. That day it stared, a searing white eye hanging above the capital like judgment itself, baking the stone of Freedom Square until it shimmered like glass. But no one moved, no umbrellas, no chanting, not even the sound of vendors calling out their prices. Only silence, dense, unsettling, unnatural. More than 70,000 people had gathered, elbows touching heads, tilted mouths half open, not to speak but to wait. Something was about to happen. Something that had never happened in the history of their country, maybe even the continent. And at the very center of this unnatural stillness stood a man whose face had become legend in whispers and graffiti, President Ibrahim Traoré. But on this day, he looked smaller somehow. Not weak, not nervous, just quiet, focused, as if he too didn't know what was about to come next. He stood atop a wooden platform hastily built just hours earlier, painted the color of dried blood and dust. No flags flapped behind him, no podium, no golden chair. Just a single table and one item placed atop it like a relic, a thick envelope sealed with Vatican red wax and rimmed with gold. It hadn't been touched, not yet. The Vatican envoy, a man in crimson robes, his hands gloved and sweating, had delivered it hours ago under heavy escort. He hadn't spoken since, just stood to the left of the president, eyes fixed on the envelope, as if it were ticking. And then slowly, President Traoré stepped forward. He wasn't dressed like a ruler, no medals, no military sash, just a cream-colored shirt, wrinkled, stained at the shoulder, and black trousers slightly too loose for his frame. A single silver pin shaped like the continent of Africa glinted on his collar. He reached for the envelope with the cautious reverence of someone handling a loaded weapon. And in that moment you could see it, his hand trembled. Only once, barely, but it did. Somewhere in the crowd a child whispered, "Is it real?" No one answered. Then with a flick of his thumb, Traoré broke the wax seal. The sound was almost nothing, a crack, a split, but it seemed to echo across the square, like the snap of a branch in a forest holding its breath. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A soldier lowered his rifle and closed his eyes. One old man dropped to his knees unprompted. The cardinal stepped forward. His robes dragged slightly across the wooden boards, collecting dust. He took the envelope gently, as if afraid it might tear or catch fire, and pulled from within it a parchment folded, once, then again, then again. He unfolded it, looked to the sky as if for permission. And then he began to read. To the people of Burkina Faso, whose dignity is not forged from gold, but from hope, and to the son of this land, Ibrahim Traoré, whom we do not call general today, but shepherd. The crowd didn't cheer. They inhaled, as one. Even the flags that usually snapped wildly in the Sahel wind had gone limp. A ripple of reaction surged through the audience like wind through dry wheat. A market woman gasped and dropped her bowl. A child clutched his mother's leg. A journalist in the press box forgot to press record. The silence became electric, wholly terrifying, because something was wrong, or right, but no one could tell which. Traoré's face, usually carved in stone during official events, softened. His eyes glistened. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked up beyond the cardinal, beyond the rooftops, towards something unseen. Some would later say they saw him mouth a name, Mama. No one knew what the rest of the letter said. Not yet. But that first line, that unexpected disarming phrase, "We do not call you general, but shepherd," had already broken something wide open. In that instant, the man many had feared, doubted, followed in silence, was suddenly someone else. Someone gentler. Someone wounded. Someone reachable. And every person in that square leaned in bodies, tilted hands, gripping phones and hearts, because deep down they knew whatever came next wasn't just for him, it was for them. The cardinal's voice was calm, too calm for the weight it carried. No microphone, no amplification, and yet every syllable he uttered reached the furthest corners of the square, as though the air itself had become a conductor for truth. His French was crisp, but his accent bore the wear of Rome. The parchment in his hand trembled slightly, but not from fear, something older, deeper. Reverence, perhaps, or guilt. "Africa does not need to be saved," he began. "Africa needs to be listened to." The words fell like rainfall on drought-cracked earth. There was no applause, not yet, only breathlessness. And then the ripple began. Near the front, an old woman who had walked barefoot to the square collapsed, not from heat, but from release, like a knot inside her chest had finally come undone. A nearby vendor rushed to her, held her upright. She was weeping, her hands trembling in her lap. He said, "We need to be heard," she whispered, as if afraid the words might vanish if she said them too loudly. A soldier in full combat gear, still dusty from his morning patrol, fell to one knee. His rifle remained slung on his back untouched. He bowed his head, not in fear, but in surrender. Around him, other soldiers stared, unsure of whether they were witnessing insubordination or something sacred. Somewhere farther back, a small boy tugged on his father's sleeve. "Did God write this?" he asked, eyes wide, voice barely audible. The man didn't respond. His jaw clenched, then trembled. The cardinal continued, his tone softening, almost intimate. "There are words a pope rarely writes by hand, fewer still that he addresses to one man. But this letter, this is not policy. It is memory." He paused and looked directly at President TRAORÉ. "I remember her," he said. "A small clay bowl in trembling hands, the smell of millet porridge in the dark. Her name was Salimata. She didn't ask who I was. She fed me. She wiped my face with her scarf. And she said, 'If a child is hungry, feed him, even if he wears silk.'" Traoré's lips parted slightly, and something shifted in his face, like glass beginning to crack under heat. The crowd stirred, sensing it. A story was unfolding that belonged to them all, but especially, deeply painfully, to him. "She didn't know she would raise a president," the cardinal went on, "but she knew she was raising a man. And in that moment, she raised us both." A sharp inhale echoed from the platform. Traoré's shoulders trembled. He blinked once, then again. And then his hands went to his face, covering it, fingers pressing hard as though trying to hold something in, or maybe hold himself together. But it didn't work. The nation watched as its leader broke, not out of weakness, but under the weight of memory. He lowered his hands slowly, eyes wet, jaw clenched. He reached for the letter in the cardinal's hand, lifted it above his head paper, trembling in the wind, and turned to face the sea of faces below. "This," he said, voice hoarse, "is not mine to keep." Then he stepped down from the platform, walked to the front edge, and handed the letter without ceremony, without guards, to a young girl sitting cross-legged on the ground. She looked no older than 7. Her dress was torn, her feet bare, but she reached up, hands steady, and accepted it like a sacred scroll. For a moment, the world did not breathe. And then, as if cued by a force no one could see, thousands lifted their heads, their eyes, their hands. No one shouted, no slogans, no singing, only the sound of thousands of people standing, not in protest, not in praise, but in recognition. Something had shifted, and no one, not even the cardinal, could name it yet. But deep inside every person in that square, a simple, aching truth had been awakened, they had been seen. And somehow that was enough. For now. Across Burkina Faso, everything stopped. Not with the jarring violence of sirens or decrees, but with the quiet agreement of a people who had just remembered something long forgotten. In the capital, taxis rolled to slow halts, drivers climbing out without a word, radios still humming static. In the markets of Bobo Dioulasso, traders set down their crates of mangoes and fabrics. No shouting, no bargaining, just stillness. A shopkeeper in Wahiguya turned the sign on her door from open to closed, not out of fear, but instinct. A grandmother midway through braiding her granddaughter's hair paused mid-loop and looked toward the sky. In villages with no electricity, elders stepped outside their clay homes sensing a weight in the air. Even the goats seemed to bleat softer. The streets normally pulsing with drum beats, motorcycle engines, and life fell under a rare hush. And then somewhere in Ouagadougou, near the steps of a school that had been shut for months due to violence, a child stood on a wooden crate and released a paper dove into the wind. It fluttered once, uncertain, then caught a gust and soared. Others followed. Crude white doves folded from old newspaper school exam sheets wrappers. Hundreds of them began to rise. Children who had never seen peace were now giving it wings. From rooftops, from alleys, from schoolyards turned to rubble, the sky filled with fragile birds that would not bleed. News cameras caught it all, first local, then regional, then global. Within hours, the images of a silent square and fluttering doves overtook social media feeds, news tickers, and headlines across the world. A letter from the Vatican halts a nation, read one banner. A continent listens, said another. The footage was looped endlessly, TRAORÉ weeping a child, receiving the letter, the sea of motionless humanity. But what the cameras couldn't capture, what no drone or headline could convey, was the feeling that had cracked open inside millions' awe. And yet alongside awe came doubt. In a cramped newsroom in Paris, an anchor turned to his producer and asked, "Is this real or just optics?" A radio caller in Nairobi muttered, "We've seen moments before, but moments don't make change." In an embassy boardroom far from Ouagadougou, a diplomat watching the footage leaned back and whispered to no one in particular, "It's beautiful, but beauty doesn't last, even inside the square." As the paper doves caught sunlight and rose higher, a quiet question pulsed beneath the stillness. Was this truly the beginning of something greater, or just a beautiful illusion suspended in a moment too fragile to survive the world's return to noise? President TRAORÉ didn't answer. He stood at the platform's edge, his back to the wind, watching the last dove vanish behind a broken spire of the old colonial church. His lips didn't move, but his eyes tracking that single piece of paper as it vanished into the sky seemed to say what no speech could. Let it fly as far as it must. If it falls, let it fall where someone dares to catch it. And still Burkina Faso did not breathe. Not yet. The room was colder than it should have been. Deep beneath the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, the war room was carved from thick concrete and dimly lit by low, flickering bulbs that gave everything a sickly yellow hue. Maps of the Sahel hung from the walls, pockmarked with colored pins and ink notations, some updated, others long irrelevant. The smell of sweat-old paper and burnt coffee lingered like a second skin. At the center of the long metal table sat the letter. Unfolded, unframed, just lying there like any other document, except none of them could look directly at it except him. President TRAORÉ sat at the head of the table, elbows on the steel hands clasped under his chin. He hadn't spoken in over 20 minutes. The generals around him exchanged silent glances, their uniforms crisp, their fingers twitching for the comfort of protocol. They had come expecting orders, mobilizations, media countermeasures, at the very least a statement. Instead, they were given silence. And in the war room, silence was the most dangerous signal of all. General Issa Barrow finally leaned forward, his voice carefully measured. "With respect, Mr. President, the people are waiting. The region is watching. We cannot govern with poetry and parables." TRAORÉ didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the letter, not scanning it, not rereading, just holding it, as if it might disappear if he blinked too long. Barrow sighed and leaned back, drumming two fingers on the table. "With even more respect, sir, you are a soldier. We trained for chaos. We do not fold beneath it." That word soldier landed harder than it should have. TRAORÉ's left hand moved slightly, tracing the edge of the parchment. He finally spoke, voice low and even. "What did you see, General, when she read the letter to the people?" Barrow hesitated. "I saw a crowd. Quiet. Moved. But crowds are like fires, sir. They burn bright and then they go out. And what did you feel?" That question unsettled the room. Feelings had no place in strategy. Another general cleared his throat, murmured something about logistics. A junior officer shifted uncomfortably. Barrow stiffened. "I felt Caution, he said, and confusion. Traoré's gaze lifted. Good. So did I. He rose from his chair, slowly walked toward the far wall, where a screen blinked with real-time drone feeds. Images of border checkpoints, convoys, militia camps. But his mind wasn't in that room anymore. It was drifting. To the jungle checkpoint in Komanjari, where his childhood friend had betrayed their unit for a satchel of foreign bills. To the cramped hospital in Kaya, where he had held the bloodied hand of a school teacher who had shielded 6 students from a blast. To the burnt remains of his grandmother's home, torched not by enemy forces, but by his own side by mistake. They said, though no apology ever came. To the moment 3 years ago in this very room, when he had ordered a retaliatory strike that killed more civilians than rebels and had to pretend it was necessary. And now to the girl in the square, barefoot, eyes wide, holding a letter that no one had expected would matter. He returned to the table, placed both palms on the cold steel, and looked around. You think I'm being sentimental, he said, but I've buried sentiment under boots and strategy for too long. And where has that gotten us? Safer borders, stronger alliances. We are a nation stitched together by fear and silence, and the thread is snapping. No one spoke. Traoré nodded almost to himself. The Vatican didn't send us orders. They sent us memory. And memory, gentlemen, is more dangerous than bullets. Another general scoffed quietly. Barrow, to his credit, stayed silent. You want a directive? Traoré continued. Fine. Here it is for the next 72 hours. No public speech, no press release, no military action. We listen, not react, not respond. Just listen. To the people, to the silence, to ourselves. He sat down again slowly with the weariness of a man carrying ghosts on his back. No strategy can win a war for a soul, and we're losing ours. And for once, not a single general argued. The Sahel at dawn was neither desert nor garden, but something patiently becoming both. President Traoré felt each grain of sand as he stepped out of the idling jeep and dismissed his escorts. He left his boots on the fender, rolled his trousers to the knee, and walked barefoot toward the faint outline of a clay shelter, half swallowed by dunes. There was no breeze yet. The horizon shimmered like a silent drumhead. 10 kilometers back, radios crackled with worry, but he carried only the folded parchment tucked against his chest, warm with his heartbeat and dust. Malam Suli, called by villagers, the prophet in the wind, was waiting beneath a grass canopy, propped on 3 crooked poles. He looked older than any desert tree beard, the color of moonlit salt eyes, clouded but bright robe patched with care. He did not rise when Traoré approached. He simply tapped the empty mat before him. The president knelt, feeling the woven fibers bite his knees, and placed the letter between them. Suli did not touch it. Instead, he closed his eyes and tilted his head, as though tuning an instrument no one else could hear. Traoré broke the silence first. They say if a man hears your counsel, he walks away lighter. Suli smiled without teeth. Lightness is easy when one carries only stories. He gestured at the parchment. That, however, is heavier than any rifle you have lifted. The president exhaled, half laugh, half ache. Will you read it? I do not read, Suli said, tapping his ear. I listen. Whisper its words once, only once, and let them rest. Traoré unfolded the letter with careful fingers. The paper had stiffened from desert heat, yet the ink still glimmered faintly where tears had fallen hours earlier. He read, voice low, the Pope's salutation to a continent, the memory of a mother offering bread, the line that renamed a general into a shepherd. Each sentence seemed to rise into the brightening sky and hang there shimmering above the dunes. When the last word left his lips, Suli's eyes remained shut for several heartbeats. Finally, the elder opened them, gaze steady, almost amused. This is not a crown, he said, tapping the air above the parchment. It is a seed. Traoré waited, unsure whether the explanation would follow. It did, but in fragments carried by the slow cadence of the desert. A crown, Suli continued, sits on one head and weighs that neck until it bends. A seed disappears, hides beneath harsh earth, and is forgotten until it breaks itself to feed others. He leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. If you wear this letter, you will buckle. If you bury it, you may feed nations. Traoré's jaw tightened. How do I bury a letter? Suli traced a circle on the mat with a weathered finger. Plant your army, he said. Not with weapons, but with words. Teach them to guard breath before borders, to carry stories before bullets. When a soldier can recite poetry in the language of his enemy, you will have fields of harvest no drought can scorch. Wind finally stirred, lifting a veil of dust that swirled between them. The elder's silhouette flickered like a mirage, but his words lodged solidly in Traoré's chest. You believe an army can unlearn the rifle? The president asked. Sully's laugh was a rasp of sand against stone. An infant unlearns the womb. Why not a soldier his barrel? He reached out not for the letter, but for Traoré's wrist. The elder's grip was surprisingly firm. Return to your city. Break the soil with silence. Water it with listening. The seed will know what to do. Traoré folded the letter once more, slipped it inside his shirt, and rose. His feet were blistered, his throat raw, yet a curious lightness tugged at his shoulders. As he turned toward the endless stretch of ochre sand, he caught Sully's final murmur, drifting on the new breeze. Remember, roots grow downward before they reach the sun. The journey back felt shorter, though the distance had not changed. Behind him, the hut seemed to dissolve into the amber haze, leaving only the echo of an instruction that would soon challenge every definition of power he had ever trusted. The palace lights burned long past midnight, not the grand chandeliers of ceremony, but the harsh overhead bulbs of back rooms where policy was usually printed, not born. The silence inside the chamber was broken only by the scratch of pen on paper and the occasional hiss of a match lighting another candle. Traoré's preferred flame over fluorescent fatigue. The letter from the Pope rested near him, folded but always within reach, like a spine anchoring each sentence he wrote. Stacks of torn paper surrounded him, pages filled, then discarded, not from frustration, but refinement. This was not a speech, not a decree. It was something slower, heavier, an idea being carved, not announced. His handwriting was uneven sometimes, drifting into the margins, as if emotion bent the ink itself. He had written the phrase "armed peace" 5 times, circled it, underlined it, then paused. Could it live beyond poetry? Could it be doctrine? On the opposite wall, a blackboard was filled with fragments, empathy as readiness, listening as reconnaissance, historical memory as defense. He drew a line through one note, "no weapons," then rewrote it, "not disarmed," recalibrated. This was not about abandoning force, it was about redefining it. By the second hour, his aide knocked softly and entered with tea. She hesitated, eyeing the growing storm of paper, but said nothing. She had seen this before. Traoré didn't draft policy like other presidents. He bled it. 3 hours and the ministers arrived. Not summoned, but expected. Word travels fast when a president refuses to sleep. They sat bleary-eyed and cautious, surrounding the low table like disciples unsure of the gospel. General Barrow was there, silent but alert. The Minister of Defense cleared his throat first. "Mr. President," he said gently, "what exactly are we preparing?" Traoré stood slow but steady. He picked up one of the marked drafts and began reading, not theatrically, but with the conviction of someone no longer asking permission to believe. Our enemies are real. Our wounds are fresh. But we must choose whether our uniforms protect people or protect fear. Starting today, our soldiers will be trained not just in terrain tactics and convoy drills, but in empathy, in our history, in restraint. Because a man who knows the past he stands on does not destroy it blindly. He looked up. Some stared back blankly. Others frowned. The Minister of Interior spoke next. "Sir, this is noble, but the people want to feel safe. They want strength." "We're not getting weaker," Traoré replied. "We're getting clearer." Another minister scoffed quietly. "You want to make philosophers out of our fighters." "No," Traoré said calmly. "I want to make humans out of our weapons." The room fell into stillness. Barrow finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "You're not disarming us," Traoré met his eyes. "No, we're not disarming. We're remembering. Who we were before war made us forget." He placed the draft onto the center of the table, ink still fresh. It was messy, unfinished, flawed, but alive. A doctrine wasn't born that night with applause or consensus. It was born, like all real things are, through resistance, breath, and the risk of being misunderstood. And across the city, dawn crept in quietly through the window, softening the hard edges of that war room. The sun hadn't changed, but the way they looked at it had. No orders were given, no banners unfurled, no speech called for it. And yet, as twilight fell over the streets of Ouagadougou, people began to appear one by one, then in twos, then in waves, holding candles. They came as families, neighbors, strangers, from city blocks still haunted by the echo of gunfire, from villages where silence had long meant surrender. Some carried their candles, upright wicks already lit. Others came holding only matches, waiting for someone else's flame to touch theirs. No one spoke, no chants, no slogans, just footfalls and breath. The square that had once held tens of thousands in electric suspense now filled again, but this time not with anticipation, nor protest, nor rage, but with quiet. Not the kind of silence born from fear. This was something else, deliberate, chosen, sacred. At first only a few hundred stood, then it was 1,000, then 3. As night deepened, the candles multiplied, little islands of light in the dark, flickering like nervous stars. Wind tugged at their flames, but people shielded them with bare hands, with cupped palms and folded paper. No one wanted to let the light go out. Among them were vendors, students, elders with walking sticks. A mother with a sleeping baby tied to her back passed a candle to an old man who had forgotten his lighter. A teenage boy lit 5 candles from one and handed them down a line of strangers. A journalist from Côte d'Ivoire, flown in to report the political ripple of the Vatican letter, lowered her camera and simply stood among the crowd, candle in hand, recording nothing. Near the western edge of the square, close to the barracks gate, a group of soldiers stood on patrol. Their posture was rigid, unsure. Uniforms, pressed rifles slung tight across their chests. They had been briefed. Possible civilian unrest, the orders had read. Remain visible. Maintain deterrence. But there was nothing to deter. The people passed by them like water around stone. No one jeered. No one recoiled. They simply walked, and then paused. From the crowd, a small girl broke formation. No older than 7, with thin braids and bare feet. Her candle was nearly gone, wax dripping over her knuckles. She walked up to the nearest soldier, tall, unsmiling, the metal of his rifle glinting under streetlight, and held the candle out to him without a word. He looked at it, then at her, then at the crowd, watching him, not expecting, not challenging, just present. The soldier bent down slowly, knees cracking under the weight of armor and uncertainty. He accepted the candle. She smiled. He didn't, but he knelt. The silence deepened as if the entire square exhaled together. Other soldiers shifted. One lowered his weapon. Another took off his helmet. No command had been given. None was needed. High above, in a window of the presidential palace, TRAORÉ stood watching. No cameras, no advisors. Just him, the darkness, and 1,000 points of fragile fire glowing across his city. He didn't smile, but his hands relaxed at his sides. Something inside him settled, not in triumph, but in awe. This wasn't his doing, not entirely. This was something older, something the people had remembered for themselves. Across the country, images of the silent march flooded the networks. But there was nothing sensational for the headlines. No clashes, no flames, no arrests. Just a girl with a candle and a soldier who knelt. That night, no curfew was broken, no orders defied, and yet something ancient was. The unwritten law that said silence belonged to the oppressed and weapons to the powerful had been rewritten without permission. And for the first time in a generation, the country didn't roar. It listened to itself breathe. At dawn, the city exhaled. The candlelight had faded into the ash of a new day, but the silence had left something behind, a vibration, a presence. It was not loud. It was not even spoken. But it moved, like a whisper traveling across a field before anyone realizes the wind has shifted. In the heart of Ouagadougou, a strange and sacred sound echoed through the streets, the call to prayer and church bells at the same time. For the first time in years, no one competed for the morning. The muezzin's voice floated gently across the rooftops, and before its final note fell, the first toll of bronze rang from the cathedral tower. Not layered, not overlapping, harmonized. People paused in doorways. Vendors stopped tying their aprons. Teachers stood still in half-written lesson plans. Something about that rhythm, mosque and church side by side, felt like a heartbeat rediscovered. In a small rural town nestled between 2 dry riverbeds, An elder imam and a retired priest walked the length of the market together, sharing a single cup of tea. The priest pointed to a group of children folding paper into shapes. "Are those doves?" he asked. The imam chuckled. "No, they say they're planting wings." Down south in a village still bearing scars from sectarian clashes, a group of women gathered on a hillside at sunset, each holding a small handwritten line from the president's new doctrine. They didn't read them aloud. They sat in a circle and listened to the wind, to the sound of one another breathing. Then one woman stood and said softly, "We remember, that's enough." Universities usually caught in the churn of protest or apathy felt the shift too. In the faculty lounge of the University of Ouagadougou, a literature professor sat alone with a steaming cup of black tea and wrote a single line on the back of a student's forgotten notebook. "This is not a parade. It is a prayer in motion." He folded the note and pinned it to the department bulletin board. By midday, 3 more lines had joined it, written in different hands. By evening, the board was covered poems, questions, declarations, and a single phrase repeated over and over again in bold charcoal, "Armed peace." Not everyone understood it. Not everyone trusted it. Some still called it theater. But even the cynics had grown quiet. Something in the nation had shifted, not dramatically, not with fireworks or votes, but subtly, insistently, like roots cracking through cement. And across the borders, other nations began to listen. A podcast host in Ghana paused mid-interview to play a voice message from a Burkina-based student describing the candlelit march. A headline in Lagos read, "When silence speaks, even guns listen." A community organizer in Rwanda printed copies of the doctrine and began translating it for local schools not to preach, but to begin a conversation. Still, Traoré said little. He remained in the capital attending briefings, reading reports, but avoiding microphones. He understood something now, that real movements didn't need choreography. They needed space. And the people given even the smallest space had filled it with grace. And so without drums, without parades, without victory, speech as a whisper became a current. It moved through churches and mosques, through farms and city squares, through blackboards and dinner tables. It did not roar, but it reached, and it stayed. The doctrine of armed peace was spreading like wildfire, but not everyone stood close enough to feel its warmth. In the cool air-conditioned chambers of the military council, where silence was often mistaken for respect, General Issa Barrow's voice cut clean through the tension. "This letter," he said, holding a crisp printout of the Vatican message between 2 fingers, like it might stain his skin, "is not doctrine. It is sentiment. We will not be ruled by robes." Around the table, a few nodded quietly. Others avoided his gaze. None openly agreed, but none openly challenged him either. Barrow had built his career on order, on chain of command, on decisiveness. He had no patience for what he called theatrics of idealism. To him, soldiers were not poets, and silence was not a strategy. It was a vacuum, and vacuums invited chaos. He tossed the letter onto the table. "Do you think a militia in the North will lay down arms because a little girl handed a soldier a candle?" He turned to one of the younger officers. "Do you think silence stops bullets?" The officer swallowed hard. "No, sir, but maybe it stops something before bullets are fired." Barrow narrowed his eyes. "That's not your call to make." The room fell quiet again. Later that evening, Barrow returned to his private quarters. He rarely checked his personal messages. His staff filtered most of them. But that night, something compelled him to pause. Sitting alone at his desk, he opened a sealed envelope left on his chair. It bore no insignia, just his name handwritten unadorned. Inside was a single card, one sentence centered written in deep blue ink. "Come speak not as a general, but as a father." He stared at it for a long time. No sender, no instructions, no agenda. Just the invitation. He almost threw it out, but his hand stopped halfway to the trash. He didn't have children of his own, never married, never had time. But once long ago, there had been a boy, his sister's son, who followed him everywhere, even during training drills. The boy had died in an ambush meant for Barrow. He hadn't spoken of it in years, hadn't allowed himself to feel it in even longer. The next morning, Barrow walked through the barracks with unusual stillness. Soldiers saluted. He returned each one with the same unreadable face, but something in his posture had changed. He paused at the shooting range, watched the recruits practice. One of them, a skinny teenager barely out of school, struggled to keep his stance. Barrow stepped forward, adjusted the boy's grip, then walked away without a word. In his pocket, the invitation remained. He had not accepted it, but he had not thrown it away either. General Isa Barrow arrived just past sunset, stepping out of the armored vehicle, not in full-dress uniform, but in a simple pressed shirt and dark slacks. He kept his military boots, though. Always the boots. His steps were heavy, deliberate, echoing across the stone walkway that led to the courtyard of the old monastery-turned-community hall. The guards at the gate didn't salute. They simply nodded as if to say, "Here everyone enters the same height." He wasn't sure why he came. The note still burned in his pocket. Come speak not as a general, but as a father. A riddle, a challenge, maybe even a trap. But something in him buried beneath rank and routine had stirred when he read it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe guilt, or maybe, though he would never say it aloud, it was longing. The courtyard was dimly lit with lanterns. In the center, a circle of low chairs had been arranged, all equal in height, none bearing titles or names. Barrow scanned the space and immediately felt out of place. Seated already were 6 others, an elderly Catholic bishop in white robes stained faintly at the hem, a Muslim sheikh with a long silver beard and eyes like river stones, a woman in a deep indigo head wrap holding prayer beads carved from baobab wood, and 3 others whose clothing and posture suggested no formal religion, just presence. No one stood as Barrow entered. No one greeted him. One of the men simply gestured to the one remaining chair. He hesitated, then sat arms folded back rigid. The sheikh broke the silence first. "You came." Barrow gave a non-committal grunt. "I was invited. Many are," said the bishop softly. "Few accept." Barrow glanced around the circle. "What is this? A council of beliefs? A holy tribunal?" "No," said the woman in indigo. "A conversation. One long overdue." Barrow's jaw clenched. "I don't answer to prophets or prayers." "No," the sheikh said again, his voice a gentle wind, "but perhaps tonight you will answer to your own silence." Barrow didn't reply. The bishop leaned forward, clasping his hands. "General, you command thousands. You influence millions. What guides your decisions if not belief?" Training, Barrow answered. "Loyalty. Order." "And what guides loyalty?" the woman asked. "Duty." "And what guides duty?" Barrow opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time in a long time, the words weren't ready. The sheikh folded his hand in his lap. "What guides a leader if not the soul?" Barrow looked away. Moments passed. Then the animist elder, who had been silent until now, spoke with a voice like dry leaves. "When we choose a tree for the drum, we do not ask how tall it stands. We ask what it sounds like when struck. If it answers with hollowness, we leave it to the termites." Barrow stiffened. "You think I'm hollow?" The elder smiled without insult. "We are all hollow until we choose what fills us." A silence settled thicker than before. Not uncomfortable, just true. Barrow sat back. His shoulders eased a fraction. He looked again at the bishop, then the woman, then the sheikh. No one demanded anything. No one accused. They simply waited as if they already knew the rhythm of his breath before he heard it himself. Finally, Barrow reached into his pocket and pulled out the card, the invitation. He laid it on the ground before them. "I don't pray," he said. "You don't have to," the bishop replied. "Just listen when your soul does." Outside the courtyard, a soft wind stirred the lantern flames. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. A dog barked once, then quieted. Barrow said nothing more, but he didn't leave. And sometimes that's the first prayer of all. The council chamber had long gone quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't seek peace, but forces reckoning. General Barrow sat unmoving in his chair, one palm resting over the folded invitation, the other clenched against his knee. The others around the circle gave him space to think, or to resist, or to retreat. Then a voice broke through the silence, not soft, not reverent, but sharp, steady, unmistakably personal. "You taught me to speak against wrong." Heads turned. At the edge of the circle stood a young woman in uniform. Her posture mirrored her father's spine, straight jaw set, but her presence was entirely her own. Sergeant Awa Barrow, decorated, disciplined, and uninvited. Barrow's eyes flicked toward her, a flash of recognition followed by something else, unease. She had not called him sir. She had not saluted. "This silence you're defending." She continued, stepping into the circle. It's not discipline. It's fear dressed in metals. Barrow said, his voice like gravel, "Not here." She didn't flinch. "If not here, then where you told me once, when I was still a cadet, that courage wasn't the roar in battle, but the voice that says enough when no one else dares to." Her words hung in the air, sharp enough to slice through protocol. "I see the streets, Baba. I've marched them. These people aren't confused. They're grieving. They're remembering. And yes, they're quiet, but not because they've been silenced, because they're choosing it, because it means something. And if we crush that with tanks or fear or old pride, then the noise that follows will not be peace. It'll be the sound of something precious breaking." Barrow's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. His face, so often granite in war rooms and speeches, cracked just faintly at the edges. He blinked twice, slowly. Then from the side of the circle, a youth leader stepped forward, barefoot, with rolled sleeves and eyes lit by firelight. In his hands, he carried a small carved djembe drum. The skin was worn, the wood polished by generations of hands. He knelt not in submission, but in offering, and extended the drum toward Barrow. "General," he said, voice low, but firm, "if you must speak, speak with rhythm, not rage." Barrow looked down at the drum, then at his daughter, then at the faces surrounding him, none accusing, none demanding, only present. He didn't reach for the drum. Not yet. But his shoulders, once stiff with resistance, softened. His clenched fist loosened. Awa stepped back into the circle, not triumphant, but steady. She knew better than anyone the war still waging behind her father's eyes. She had fought it too. And in the flickering quiet, a choice took root, not shouted, not signed, but felt. Barrow didn't speak again that night, but he stayed. And the drum remained between his hands, waiting. The air inside the hall had thickened, not with heat or tension, but with stillness. No one moved. No one dared. The drum still sat between General Barrow's hands, untouched, as if it were something fragile or sacred. His fingers hovered over the edge of the skin, not pressing, not playing, just remembering what it felt like to touch something that couldn't kill. His eyes had stopped scanning the room. They had softened, settled, focused on no one, and yet everyone. Awa stood just a few paces away, not speaking, her breath, slow arms loose at her sides. The council had fallen silent again, not with expectation this time, but with respect. They had offered their words. The rest would be his decision. Then slowly, deliberately, Barrow reached up and touched the brim of his military cap. It had been a constant part of him for over 3 decades. It had seen uprisings, border conflicts, funerals, medals. It had covered his head through victory parades and behind closed-door threats. To remove it had never been an option. Not on duty, not in public, not in front of soldiers. But now in a room of faith and silence, he lifted it off. The fabric made no sound, but the gesture did. A wave of quiet shifted through the circle like a wind through tall grass. No one clapped. No one cried. They only watched as Barrow turned the cap in his hands, stared at it for a long moment, then lowered it to his side. "I will listen," he said. 3 words, that was all. But they landed with the weight of an entire lifetime of noise and armor cracking open. The bishop bowed his head slightly. The sheikh closed his eyes. The animist elder smiled, a soft, tired smile that knew how long such moments take to arrive. Barrow stood, cap still in hand. He looked to his daughter, then the door. Outside, the square was full. Word had traveled faster than any broadcast. Thousands had gathered, not with protest signs, not with slogans, but with silence. They stood with candles, with folded paper doves, with children on their shoulders. No podium had been built. No barricades were in place. When Barrow emerged, the crowd did not cheer. They simply parted. He walked slowly, cap in hand, head bare beneath the open sky. Some soldiers in the outer ranks stiffened at the sight, uncertain whether to salute or stand down. Others lowered their weapons instinctively, their own hats suddenly feeling heavier than before. Barrow did not raise a hand. He did not issue a command. He just kept walking through the quiet, through the crowd, through the weight of a country, learning to breathe again. And from somewhere in the center of the crowd, a single gem of beat began, soft, tentative, steady. Not a march, not a war song, just a rhythm, waiting to be joined. It began with a single line in a midnight interview, poorly lit, streamed from a flickering webcam, a voice grainy with emotion and dust. "I was there," the man said. "I saw it happen." That letter, It's not real. He was introduced only as a former aide to the Presidential Communications Office. His face blurred, his voice distorted. But what he said needed no polish to hit like an earthquake. It was a fabrication, a political stunt. The Vatican never sent it. The president's inner circle wrote it themselves. Within hours, the clip had been shared over 2 million times. By morning, every major outlet from Paris to Pretoria was spinning versions of the same headline. Was the Pope's letter a hoax? TRAORÉ's truth or trick, hope forged in gold seal. The footage of the aide was replayed endlessly. Pundits dissected every sentence, every pause. A shaky phone photo of a supposed early draft was circulated, showing a signature that looked almost right, but just off enough to seed doubt. The shift in tone was immediate and brutal. Broadcasters who had only days earlier wept on air over Burkina Faso's miracle of silence now lean forward with narrowed eyes. If this letter is fake, one anchor said, then everything built upon it becomes a performance, a manipulation. In cafes and classrooms, mosques and markets, the conversation turned. At first whispers, then anger, then fear. "I told you it was too perfect," muttered a mechanic in Kudugu, tossing his radio aside. A teacher in Tenkodogo wept in front of her students, unsure whether to continue reading from the curriculum now inspired by the armed peace doctrine. Even in the streets of Ouagadougou, where the silent march had become a nightly ritual, fewer candles were lit that evening. Some were crushed underfoot. Others were left burning too long, the wax bubbling into ruin. On social media, the divide was instant and vicious. Hashtags collided like street mobs. Hashtag forge peace. Hashtag real hope. Hashtag puppet president. Hashtag let the seed grow. Traoré did not speak. He refused interviews. He did not tweet. In the silence, speculation became gospel. For many, that silence was guilt, but the real fracture came from within. In a tense, closed-door meeting with senior ministers, the interior minister slammed his palm against the table. "We are unraveling," he said, voice hoarse. "And for what a beautiful lie. This is why we don't build movements on poetry." Barrow, seated quietly in the corner, said nothing. Awa stood against the wall, arms crossed, eyes burning. The doctrine's printed pages were already being pulled from schools in the South. NGOs paused programming. A regional summit on nonviolence meant to be hosted in Ouagadougou was postponed indefinitely. In the countryside where the letter had reached by radio and rumor, some tore it from their bulletin boards. Others simply folded it away quietly, as if placing a flower atop a grave. The whisper that had once traveled like grace now returned like a question, sharp and unrelenting. Was hope a lie? But in the noise, a few voices still held the note. A child in Fadangurma asked his mother if it made him cry, even if it's fake. Does that mean it didn't matter? She had no answer. And in the capital, alone in his private chamber, Traoré sat at his desk with the original letter in hand. The parchment was creased now, the gold seal slightly chipped. He traced the edge with a thumb, then placed it gently in the drawer. He didn't lock it. He didn't need to. For even truth, when questioned enough, begins to wonder whether it was ever real. And outside, the last candle of the night flickered once, then died. The palace corridors buzzed like a hive without direction. Advisors shuffled between rooms. Phones rang. Unanswered reporters camped outside the gates in clusters that grew by the hour. Statements were drafted, retracted, redrafted again. International agencies requested interviews, demanded confirmation or denial. Ministers circled, pressured, pleaded. But President Traoré said nothing. For 48 hours, the most watched man in Africa vanished from the conversation. No press briefings, no radio addresses, no camera appearances. Only a closed door, a quiet window, and the absence of a voice that once lit a nation on fire. Many took his silence as confirmation. "He has nothing," said one prominent anchor in Abidjan. "Even his stillness feels like surrender." Others mourned quietly, as if a death had occurred, not of a man, but of something more delicate. Something many had only just dared to believe in. And then on the evening of the second day, as the sun spilled gold across Ouagadougou's tired skyline, a movement stirred at Freedom Square. No official announcement had been made. No motorcade, no security convoy. Just footsteps, slow, steady, solitary. President Traoré emerged on foot. He wore no sash. No bodyguards trailed him. His shirt was plain sleeves rolled to the elbow. In his hands, a single sheet of paper folded once. The crowd already gathered in rumor tightened. Many had brought candles again, though few were lit. Some brought their skepticism. Some brought their anger. Most brought only questions. Traoré climbed the same platform where weeks earlier, a cardinal had read aloud the letter that had changed everything. He said nothing for a long time. The wind picked up. The square braced for a speech, a defense, a confession. Instead, he held up the paper in his hands, not the Vatican letter. Something else, thinner, newer, less formal. He unfolded it and read. Even if the paper was empty, the tears were not. Even if the seal was wax and not holy, the silence it summoned was real. Even if the name at the bottom was written by a tired hand and not a pope's, I saw a soldier kneel. And that's all the truth I need. He paused, then added quietly, "This was written yesterday by a 19-year-old nurse's assistant named Fanta. She volunteered to hand out candles at our first march. I asked her if she wanted to be president one day. She laughed and said, 'No, but maybe I'll teach one.'" He lowered the page. The crowd was still. "I don't know what ink this moment was written with," he continued, "but I know what it cost, and I know what it changed. So if you're asking whether the letter is real, I have only one answer. We are." Silence returned, but this time it did not feel like absence. It felt like listening. In the back of the crowd, someone lit a candle, then another, and another. No applause followed, no anthems played. But in the hush that fell in the thousand small flames returning to trembling hands, a nation began again, not by proof, but by choice. And sometimes that's the stronger thing. The confirmation did not arrive with trumpets or televised addresses. It came instead in the form of a quiet courier, an elderly priest from the apostolic nunciature, who stepped off a modest plane with 2 letters sealed in Vatican red. One addressed to the president of Burkina Faso. The other, handwritten in delicate ink, simply read, "To Madame Traoré, with eternal gratitude." For 2 days the country had balanced on the edge of belief. The silence had become sacred again, but also fragile. Some had begun to hope, not because they were sure, but because they needed to be. Faith had turned from doctrine into decision, and then came the proof, quiet, undeniable, and impossibly human. Traoré's mother had long lived in a modest clay brick house near the edge of Ouagadougou's oldest market. She never left. Even after her son became president, she refused to move into the palace. Too many rooms, she'd say, too far from the tomatoes. She was not told a letter was coming. The priest arrived in the early morning, dusty from travel, and found her slicing okra at a street stall with 2 neighborhood children perched nearby. When she saw him, she squinted, wiped her hands on her apron, and offered him a seat. He handed her the envelope, bowed, and said nothing else. Inside, the note was brief. Many years ago, in a small market alley, a tired foreign seminarian was given warm food and water by a woman who asked for nothing. That food sustained a future pope. That memory has never left me. Today I thank you not as a pontiff, but as a son of the Sahel. Leo Bortitar, below it a photograph, a much younger Traoré's mother, smiling in front of a clay stove, handing bread to a tall, thin stranger, with sunburned cheeks and a rosary half hidden beneath his collar. She looked at it for a long time, then said almost to herself, "He had kind eyes, but terrible French." When reporters arrived later that day, having caught wind of the delivery, she met them with the same worn apron and weathered hands. She did not seek the cameras. But when asked how she felt about the Pope's letter, her answer was simple. "A mother feeds all sons. It's not political, it's just decent." That quote exploded across headlines and hashtags within hours. A mother feeds all sons. The phrase was painted on banners, printed on t-shirts, carved into the side of a church door in Koudougou. In a world suspicious of leaders, her words landed as gospel. At the presidential palace, Traoré read the second letter in his private chamber. He held it for a long time, then walked to his mother's house that evening, unannounced. She opened the door without surprise, slapped his chest playfully, and said, "Now they'll never leave me alone, you know." He smiled. She added, "But I'll keep cooking anyway, revolution or not." The rumors died after that, or rather, they transformed. What began as a scandal had become a seed of folklore. The Pope's first letter moved a nation. The second reminded it why it had moved at all. And in that quiet corner of the capital, beside a pot of rice and firewood, The legacy of peace found its most unshakable home, not in policy, but in humility. The sun was already high, and the dust along the road still hadn't settled. It rose in soft spirals every time a barefoot child ran past laughter, spilling into the morning like spilled millet. In a remote village far from the presidential square and echoing headlines, a mango tree stood like a sentinel, its roots thick branches broad, casting a circle of dappled shade across the clearing. Beneath it a blackboard leaned against the trunk, old but proud, its corners worn the surface still bearing faint traces of yesterday's lesson. A young teacher no older than 23 knelt before the board, with a piece of chalk clutched between her fingers like a quill. Her name was Aminata. She had once dreamt of becoming a doctor, then a radio host, then, when the war came, a refugee. Now she taught. And when she taught, she whispered to the future. Today, before her students arrived, she wrote a single sentence across the board, her handwriting slow, careful, almost ceremonial. When God speaks, children listen. But adults must decide if they'll change. She stepped back, brushing chalk from her fingers, and stared at the words. They had come to her the night before, as she lay listening to the radio. The rebroadcast of President TRAORÉ reading the young nurse's poem, followed by the news of the Second Vatican letter. There had been no announcement in her village, no press, no protests, just a moment, a shift, something opening. She had not needed to be told what it meant. One by one, the children arrived. They brought no books. Some didn't even have shoes, but they came carrying stones, flat ones used to hold down paper in the wind. Aminata greeted them with a smile, then stepped aside so they could read the board. A small boy with eyes too old for his face tilted his head. "Who said that?" he asked. She replied, "You did. All of you. Every time you listen." They sat cross-legged in the dirt. Some chewed mango peels. One brought his baby sister wrapped in cloth. Another held a stick like a sword, but laid it down as the lesson began. They studied not algebra nor politics, but something older. Stories, symbols. What it meant to stand quietly in a noisy world, and what that silence could shape. Across the country, similar scenes began to appear, open-air classrooms sprouting like wildflowers. In the north, teachers held lessons on ethics under corrugated roofs. In the west, imams and priests co-taught scripture as shared narrative, not division. In the city slums, a soldier-turned-instructor used his old helmet as a makeshift globe. No one mandated these schools. No budget funded them. They were simply born of something whispered first in a square, then heard in a poem, and now etched in chalk beneath a mango tree. Aminata's students listened and asked questions most adults had forgotten how to ask. Can silence be louder than shouting? Do drums lie? Was the Pope ever hungry like us? Aminata didn't always answer. Sometimes she just smiled and said, "Let's find out." That day when class ended, the children gathered their papers, their stones, their baby siblings, and filed quietly out of the shade. One girl lingered, stared once more at the sentence on the board, then added a line beneath it with her own chalk stub. "We are listening. Please don't stop speaking." And in the branches above the mango tree, rustled not from wind, but as if it too had heard. There were no walls, no flags, no uniforms. The only boundary was the shade of the trees, and even that shifted with the sun. The classroom was nothing more than a clearing behind the ruins of an old post station where goats once wandered and rebels had briefly set up a camp years ago. The ground was uneven, the seating improvised, stones, logs, upturned crates. But no one complained. In this place where silence had once meant fear, it now meant space to begin again. The children came from every path. Some wore wooden crosses around their necks. Others had small leather Quranic pouches tied to their waists. A few came with markings on their foreheads from animist rituals. None of that mattered when they sat down. No one asked who prayed to what. Only, "Can I sit here?" And the answer was always yes. The teachers were not professors. They were people who had known fire, sometimes lit it themselves, and now came to teach with scarred hands and unarmored hearts. There was Musa, once a soldier, who now taught geography using war maps to explain the cost of each border. There was Clarice, a poet who had lost her husband to a militia and now recited verses to teach memory as resistance. There was Bako, a quiet farmer who taught math using cassava roots and rainfall charts. And then there were the elders, They did not teach from books. They told stories slowly, carefully, like stitching fabric. Stories of how the river used to rise higher, how salt once cost more than silver, how silence was not weakness, but a choice made by the wise. The children listened as if they were drinking water in the dry season. There were no tests, no report cards, but there were lessons. One day, an 11-year-old boy asked, "If everyone here is so different, why do we understand each other now?" Clarice looked at him for a moment and answered, "Because none of us are shouting." There were moments of conflict, of course. Children pushed, argued, cried, but no one was exiled. Instead, they were invited to sit in a separate circle, guided by a former soldier and a grandmother who once lost two sons to opposing sides. That circle wasn't for punishment, it was for pause. Before you speak, the grandmother would say, "Listen to what your silence is trying to tell you." In the evenings, the children often lingered. Some stayed just to sweep. Others waited until the last elder had finished their final story. And when they left, they didn't say goodbye. They just nodded like citizens of something still being built. They were learning about each other, about the past, about what it meant to choose peace over pride. Not because someone told them to, but because the silence that had once haunted their homes had become something different. A teacher now. The last lesson of the week wasn't taught with chalk or history maps. It came in the form of a folded children's book. Its pages wrinkled its corners, chewed slightly by time. Awa, now visiting village schools as a mentor, held it up before the gathered children beneath the neem tree and began to read. The story was simple. Once there was a lion who ruled the savannah. He was strong, feared, and loud. His roar could shake the leaves from the trees, scatter antelope like wind. Other animals bowed not from respect, but because their knees shook when he passed. But then came a great fire, one he could not stop by roaring. The trees burned, the grass vanished, and the roar only echoed back to him, hollow and helpless. So the lion grew quiet. He stopped roaring. Instead he listened. To the mice who knew how to hide seeds, to the birds who remembered where water used to be, to the turtles who had walked farther than he ever had. And slowly the savannah returned, not because of his voice, but because of his silence. As Awa closed the book, a small hand rose. A boy no more than 7 tilted his head and asked, "But why didn't the lion roar again when the land came back?" The other children turned curious. Awa knelt beside him, her voice soft but certain. "Because sometimes," she said, "silence is braver." The boy nodded slowly, not entirely sure he understood, but sensing something important had been said. His fingers traced the edge of the book's cover, where the lion stood drawn in golden ink, his mouth closed, eyes open. Around them, the clearing was quiet, not the empty kind, but the full kind, like the space between two heartbeats. The trees swayed gently. No anthem played, no applause followed. But in the stillness, the children sat a little straighter, their eyes a little wider. And one of them whispered, "Maybe we can be lions too." There was no press release, no ribbon cutting, only wind. On the outskirts of Ouagadougou, where red earth meets thorn grass and the Sahel stretches its arms wide, there now stood a grove, 54 trees, one for each tribe of Burkina Faso. Some tall and strong, others still small, bent slightly with the wind as if listening to a language older than words. Each tree bore a small wooden sign carved not with numbers or names, but with symbols, ancestral motifs, tribal patterns, a line of verse, a silent story. The grove was not a museum. It was not a park. It was a breathing memory. At its center stood a single carved plaque, aged intentionally with these words etched into it. "We were never called to rule, only to rise." Children, not guards, were its keepers. They guided visitors not with instructions, but with stories. A boy from the Bissa tribe spoke of how his grandfather once walked for 3 days just to ask forgiveness from a former enemy. A girl from the Mossi whispered that her tree bloomed early, just after the rain stopped fighting the dust. They didn't charge entry. Instead, they offered questions. "Do you remember where your roots are? Can you grow without making someone else smaller?" It was there beneath the baobab planted by TRAORÉ himself that the president's chair was finally left empty. No announcement had been made. One morning the flag still flew, but TRAORÉ did not arrive for his meeting. His closest advisor found a folded note on his desk written in his steady hand. "A voice raised too long becomes an echo. Let the next word be someone else's." He had retired quietly. No farewell speech, No medals, only the grove. Some say he still visits early in the morning, dressed like any farmer tracing the trunks with his fingers. Others say he left for the Sahel again to find Malam Suli, or perhaps just to walk. But what he left behind no longer needed guarding. The roots had taken hold. At exactly noon on a cloudless Thursday, the country stopped. Not from fear, not from decree, but from a sound. It began with a single bell, soft, almost hesitant, from a chapel in Banfora. Then another from a mosque in Kaya, overlapping with the long, rising call to prayer. Soon came the low thrum of ancestral drums in the south, joined by the clink of ceremonial cowbells tied to dancers' ankles in the highlands. No one had planned it, no one had scheduled it, but somehow across Burkina Faso, church towers, minarets, villages, cities, fields, markets all rang out at once. It wasn't noise, it was recognition. Traffic halted. Children looked up from their school books. Vendors paused with coins mid-count. A bride and groom stopped in the middle of their vows and simply held each other. Goats froze. Radios turned down. Pots removed from flame. The country leaned inward, as if listening for something it almost forgot it knew. And for 60 heartbeats, no one spoke. In a radio station in Uwahiguya, a veteran broadcaster known for his political fire and nightly sarcasm found himself wordless behind the mic. The sounds had reached him through a live caller in Bobo Dioulasso, then another in Tenkodogo, then another from the Ghana border. He covered his mouth, then his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. This is what Africa sounds like, when it loves itself out loud. The clip went viral within the hour, not because it was viral, but because people needed it to be. The moment was replayed, analyzed, choreographed in classrooms, and reimagined in murals. But those 60 seconds belonged to no one, not even to history. They were a breath shared across borders, bloodlines, beliefs. A reminder that unity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it rings. That year, during his Urbi et Orbi address from the balcony above St. Peter's Square, Pope Leo X paused longer than usual. Cameras tightened, expecting words on war, hunger, or diplomacy. Instead, he said this: "A star does not choose its sky, but sometimes it lights a continent." There was no direct mention of a letter. None was needed. Everyone watching knew. He smiled gently, then added, "May the silence of Burkina Faso teach us how to hear again." The next day, across cafes and Accra churches, in Nairobi classrooms in Tunis, and refugee camps in Sudan, the phrase was written in chalk and charcoal, in ink and in ash. Don't just pray it, be it. In Ouagadougou, a small girl named Salimata sat in one of the open-air classrooms beneath the mango tree. She had been quiet all day, scribbling into a battered notebook with a pencil worn to the wood. When the teacher approached and asked what she was working on, she shyly held up a single page. Across it, written in 5 different languages, Moore, French, Arabic, English, and Fula, was the same word, peace, each letter colored by hand, each script shaped carefully as if she feared getting it wrong. Around the words, she had drawn tiny trees, bells, and stars. And in one corner, a lion, quiet, smiling, proud. No ceremony followed. No news crew arrived. But when she stood and taped the paper to the side of the classroom's blackboard, the other students gathered staring. One of them asked why all the languages Salamata answered. "So no one feels left out." The teacher didn't say anything, just smiled, then stepped back, letting the word take the space it needed. That night, as the wind passed through the trees and the stars blinked silently above the savannah, no one spoke. They didn't have to, because sometimes the most powerful story isn't the one shouted in glory, but the one whispered gently into the soil, carried by children, remembered in silence, and chosen again every single day. This story isn't just about a letter or a leader. It's about the quiet courage it takes to choose peace in a world addicted to noise. It reminds us that real change often begins not with grand speeches, but with silent choices: a soldier kneeling, a child listening, a leader stepping back. The most powerful revolutions aren't always loud. They grow like roots, unseen but unstoppable. In a time when division seems louder than unity, this tale whispers a timeless truth. Peace is not passive, it's a decision, a discipline, a daily act of bravery. Question for you: have you ever experienced a moment when silence spoke louder than words? What did it teach you? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.